Chairman Warren and Ranking Member Van Hollen, thanks for holding this hearing. Welcome, General Bondi.
Thank you, Senator.
Good to see you. I want to raise with you something that's been deeply concerning to me, General Bondi. The 2024 Democrat nominee for Vice President actually called federal immigration agents Donald Trump's modern-day Gestapo. This is dangerous for our agents, it's wrong, and it cuts against and it undercuts the rule of law. So I want to ask you a series of questions, General Bondi, and if you would accommodate me, I would appreciate it. First, you'll agree when a bill is passed by Congress and signed by the President, it's law, right?
Yes, Senator.
And until that law is changed by Congress, you have a duty to follow it, right? That's what the rule of law is.
Yes, Senator.
So let me read the law.
In federal court, and the ramifications of this are nothing short of explosive. Attorney General Pam Bondi has just been handed what can only be described as a devastating 1-2 punch from the federal judiciary. And what's emerging from these rulings is deeply troubling. We're not talking about minor procedural setbacks or technical legal disputes that get resolved on appeal. No, what we're looking at here are findings of systematic misconduct, unlawful exercises of power, and potential criminal behavior, all documented in official court records by federal judges who don't mince words. 2 separate federal judges have issued rulings that don't just dismiss the cases Bondi's Justice Department brought against James Comey and Letitia James. These rulings systematically tear apart the entire legal apparatus that was constructed to pursue what many observers are characterizing as politically motivated revenge prosecutions, devised and executed from the very beginning. Let's start with the foundation because this is where everything begins to crumble. Senior Judge Cameron McGowan Curry examined the appointment of Lindsay Halligan, the interim U.S. attorney who was specifically selected by Bondi and Trump to handle these high-profile prosecutions targeting their political adversaries. And what Judge Curry discovered should send shockwaves through anyone who cares about the rule of law and proper legal procedure. Halligan's appointment as interim U.S. attorney was unlawful from the very start. She never had the legal authority to act in that capacity. Now, this isn't some minor technicality we're talking about. Federal law establishes very specific procedures for who can serve as a U.S. attorney and under what circumstances. These laws exist for critically important reasons. They prevent presidents from simply installing political allies or loyalists into these enormously powerful positions without proper oversight, Senate confirmation, or the institutional safeguards that are supposed to exist. These are positions that wield the full prosecutorial power of the federal government. The people who occupy them can destroy lives, bring criminal charges, seek imprisonment. That's why there are rules about who can hold these positions and how they get there. Judge Curry found that those rules weren't followed. The appointment was legally defective, and here's where it gets really significant, because Halligan lacked lawful authority to serve as U.S. attorney. Everything she did while purporting to act in that role was legally invalid. Every action she took, every document she signed, every indictment she secured, all of it represents what Judge Curry characterized as an unlawful exercise of executive power. The judge didn't leave any room for ambiguity here. The ruling states clearly that everything stemming from H. Halligan's defective appointment, including the indictments against Comey and James, must be dismissed. Think about the implications of this for a moment. The prosecutions targeting 2 of Donald Trump's most prominent critics, 2 individuals who Trump has publicly and repeatedly attacked and threatened. These prosecutions were built on a foundation that never legally existed in the first place. It's not that the evidence was weak or the legal theories were questionable, though we'll get to problems with those aspects shortly. It's that the entire prosecutorial authority being exercised was void from inception. It's as if someone who wasn't actually a lawyer tried to file legal documents, or someone who wasn't actually a judge tried to issue rulings. The basic threshold requirement for legal authority simply wasn't met. This raises obvious and troubling questions. How did this happen? Did Bondi and her team at the Justice Department not understand the legal requirements for interim appointments? That seems unlikely, given that these are supposedly sophisticated legal professionals Or did they understand the requirements, but choose to ignore them, gambling that they could push these prosecutions through before anyone challenged the underlying authority? Either possibility is deeply problematic. Either we're looking at gross incompetence in understanding basic appointment law, or we're looking at a deliberate decision to circumvent legal requirements in pursuit of political objectives. But Judge Curry's ruling, as damaging as it is, represents only the first blow. The second comes from Magistrate Judge William Fitzpatrick, who took a careful look at the grand jury proceedings in the Comey case, and what Judge Fitzpatrick found should alarm anyone who understands how the criminal justice system is supposed to function. He described what he discovered as a disturbing pattern of profound investigative missteps. Let's pause on that language for a moment because federal judges don't throw around phrases like that casually. Judges are trained to be measured and precise in their language. Their written opinions become part of the permanent legal record. They're cited in future cases, analyzed by scholars, read by historians. When a federal judge characterizes conduct as disturbing and describes investigative errors as profound, that judge is deliberately creating a record of serious misconduct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate your leadership of this important subcommittee. Welcome, Attorney General Bondi. It's good to see you. Just yesterday, I met in my office with the advocates who work with survivors of domestic violence in rural Maine, along with Chairman Moran and other members of this committee. I was one of the lead sponsors of the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2022.
This isn't a judge expressing mild concern about minor errors. This is a judge documenting fundamental failures in how a prosecution was conducted. What specifically did Judge Fitzpatrick find? First, he identified fundamental misstatements of law that were presented to the grand jury. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to understand the role of a grand jury in the federal system. Grand juries are supposed to serve as a critical check on prosecutorial power. They're made up of ordinary citizens who review evidence and determine whether there's probable cause to believe a crime was committed and whether charges should be brought. This is a constitutional safeguard enshrined in the Fifth Amendment, designed to protect individuals from overzealous or politically motivated prosecutions. But here's the thing. Grand jurors aren't lawyers. They rely on prosecutors to explain the law, to tell them what legal standards apply, to help them understand what elements need to be proven for a particular crime. Prosecutors have an obligation, both legal and ethical, to present the law accurately. They're officers of the court. They have a duty of candor. When prosecutors misstate the law to a grand jury, they're not just making innocent mistakes. They're corrupting the entire process because grand jurors can't properly evaluate evidence if they're applying the wrong legal standards. Judge Fitzpatrick found that prosecutors fundamentally misrepresented legal requirements to the grand jurors in the Comey case. That means the grand jury was making decisions based on incorrect legal information. They may have voted to indict based on evidence that wouldn't actually support charges under the correct legal standards. This isn't aggressive prosecution or creative legal theory. This is misleading the grand jury, which undermines the entire purpose of having grand juries in the first place. Before we continue breaking down these devastating findings, if you're finding this coverage valuable and want to see more in-depth analysis like this, please consider subscribing to The Ethan Show. We're working toward our goal of 10,000 subscribers, and every subscription helps us continue bringing you detailed coverage of these critical legal and political developments. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. But the problems Judge Fitzpatrick identified don't stop with misstatements of law. He also found that potentially privileged material was improperly presented to the grand jury. Legal privilege isn't some technical loophole. It exists to protect fundamental rights and relationships. Attorney-client privilege, for example, protects confidential communications between lawyers and their clients, ensuring that people can seek legal advice candidly without fear that their conversations will be used against them later. When prosecutors bring privileged material before a grand jury, they're violating those protections and potentially tainting the entire proceeding. Think about how this works in practice. If grand jurors see privileged communications they shouldn't have access to, that information can influence their decision-making in ways that fundamentally undermine fairness. They might base their vote on information that should have been excluded, information that could prejudice them against the target of the investigation. Once that bell is rung, you can't unring it. The damage is done. And according to Judge Fitzpatrick, that's exactly what happened here. Privileged material was improperly put before the grand jury. Then we get to what might be the most shocking aspect of Judge Fitzpatrick's findings. He determined that the indictment process was so chaotic and disorganized that it's unclear whether the grand jury ever actually reviewed and approved the final charges that were filed against Comey. Read that again because it's almost hard to believe. In a normal, properly functioning prosecution, prosecutors draft an indictment, present it to the grand jury jurors review it and vote on whether to approve it, and only then is the indictment officially filed. That's how the system is supposed to work. That's what the Constitution requires. But Judge Fitzpatrick